Welcome to Foundation. For more episodes, check out foundation.kr. Today at the Google Ventures CEO Summit, we had a chance to sit down with Ben Horowitz. He is the co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, invested in a bunch of great companies, and has a lot of great advice for entrepreneurs. Let's chat with him. So let's, I want to start at the beginning. I'm curious about your background. When did you first get out to the Bay Area?
So I actually got out here, well, I grew up in the People's Republic of Berkeley, so that kind of counts as the Bay Area, but not necessarily Silicon Valley. But I went to school in New York, and I got back here to Silicon Valley, which I'd never been in before. Basically, I grew up in Berkeley. I had never been over here as a summer intern engineer for a company called Silicon Graphics, which actually used to be located right where Google is. And it was the Google of its day. It was sort of, had all the best engineers. It was the greatest environment. It was the best building. It was, everybody good one. And they were working on the most amazing things that you could ever imagine.
Cool looking computers too. The enclosures were awesome.
Oh yeah. No, everything about it, the design, like it was just like, blew my mind. And just how smart everybody was there. It was crazy.
So you had a CS degree then?
Yeah.
So were you coding at that point?
Yeah. So I was working on, at that time, this is some real trivia. There was the operating system for Silicon Graphics was called IRIX, and they were coming out with the first multiprocessor machines. And so we had to take IRIX, which was built for a single processor, and make it work on multiprocessors. So those of you who are engineers know, so you got to put semaphores around all of the various routines and whatnot. And a lot of my job was just like crashing IRIX. Like, can you make it crash, Ben? I'm like, oh yeah, I can make it crash. I'll write a program. And so, that's kind of how I got started. But my boss, who I work with, he's in one of our portfolio companies, Chris Wagner, I would panic the kernel. And like when kernel panic, for those of you who aren't engineers, is particularly hard to debug because there are no tools. You're at the lowest level. So you just get like this dump of hexadecimal, like incomprehensible stuff that you can look at. And my boss would look at the hex dump and he would go, oh, in that address there, that should be a pointer, not a value. And I would be like, how the hell do you know that? But that, that's how smart those guys were.
And so after that, you moved on, and then you joined, I believe, Netscape. Was it Netscape right after that, or?
Well, no, not right after. So I went to a startup, and that startup taught me like best cure for startup fever. Join a startup.
Was that something that you had launched yourself, or were you an engineer there?
No. I was an engineer there, and then I ended up kind of being a product manager at the end, and then eventually I got to Netscape. Which was Netscape, because it was Jim Clark and Silicon, a lot of SGI people, I thought it would be a good company. And then when I like most people who were alive then, when I saw the browser, I was just like shocked and amazed, like what a breakthrough it was.
And that's when you first obviously met Mark there.
Yeah, that's where I met Mark, or as I like to call him, Big Tunchi.
So when did you decide that, I want to be a CEO? Did you guys worked on, was it LoudCloud initially together?
Yeah, so after Netscape, we started a company in 1999 called LoudCloud, which was one of the original cloud computing companies. And it turned out 1999 was too early to start that company. It turns out that much more recently was better. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One, hardware hadn't gotten commoditized in the same way, so servers were proprietary and from a company called Sun that some of you may remember. And then there was no virtualization, like server virtualization pretty much didn't exist in those days. So a lot of the things that are pretty easy in cloud computing now were harder and possible. And then bandwidth was extremely expensive. $1,500 a megabit when we started. So for those of you who understand bandwidth pricing, that's high.
And so you grew that company to how many people?
So, well, it grew to about 650. It then shrunk, I shrunk it to about 80. And then it grew back up to about 550 by the time we sold it.
How do you deal with company morale when you have to go through something like that?
A lot of crying from me. It was hard. So, you know, at that time, and it was a very different time. So most of the companies in that era ran into some type of trouble in that the environment for like money, the capital markets went from anybody could raise any amount of money at any valuation to you can't raise any money at all. So to give you an example, when we were 9 months old, we raised money at $700 million pre-money valuation. And it wasn't very hard. Then a few months later, maybe 6 months later, we were forced to go public. We couldn't raise money privately at all. The only way to raise money was to have an IPO. I went public with 4 weeks of cash in the bank at a $400 million pre-money valuation. So that's quite a startling change in capital markets environment. And so one nice thing about that time was everybody was getting killed. It wasn't just us. So I didn't seem as stupid as I might have, although I seemed pretty stupid to the employees. And you know, with morale, when we, you know, a lot of it was just trying to be as honest as possible. I would say, you know, just like, this is what happened, this is where we are, these are the mistakes that we made, and this is the plan going forward. And you know, one of the things I did when we changed the business from Loud Cloud, which was cloud computing, into Opsware, which was basically the software to control a cloud, I took everybody off site and I just said, look, this is a new company. We're doing something new. We're changing the name of the company. And here's why I think you should join. And I just tried to talk everybody into joining again. And at the end of the talk, I said, you know, if you want to join, that's great. We're going to give you a new stock option package and we're starting again today. And if you don't want to join, that's okay. But all I would ask from you is you just tell me now. And it doesn't mean I'm going to walk you out the door, but let me and you work on, you know, finding you a job over the next couple of months. And don't kind of halfway do it. Because if anybody here is halfway in, that's going to be a huge problem for us. And people, thankfully, took me up on that. And 2 people quit that day. And then of the other 80 we had, I think we kept all but 2 for the next 5 years.
Wow. What was Mark's role during this time?
Well, he was chairman. So his main role was to basically torture me. So, you know, early on, you know, Mark is super creative. He's probably the most creative person I know in terms of coming up with new ideas. But then as the company was get rid of all the ideas and like narrow it down to like the one thing that might work, he became more of a chairman and less of a kind of co-founder. But it was nice to have somebody to talk to. You know, CEO, one of the problems with being CEO, and I know a lot of you guys are CEO, or this is the CEO Summit, so most of you are, is you're sort of all alone. And you know that there's things that are going wrong in the company, and you're not quite sure how bad, but you're very worried. But if you talk to people about them in the company, you most likely will make them much worse, because then you'll potentially increase the worry, particularly if they're abstract concerns. And so it's a very kind of tough job in that way, and having somebody like Mark who I could talk to about it was always, you know, it was just nice to have somebody to talk to, I would say, more than anything else.
How do you manage your staff? Like, you've written before about giving direct feedback to staff, even if it's negative.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I think, you know, that's an important point. I think there's a big kind of thing in the culture now in technology where, like, the war for talent, it's a war for talent and we've got to win the war, and like that means that we have to make everybody feel good about themselves at all time. And the problem with that, of course, is it's like pretty dishonest, because not everybody is doing a good job at all times. And in fact, every employee in Silicon Valley and every CEO here and me, like, we all have something terribly wrong with us. And so there's going to be things that are wrong. So like being nice to everybody all the time or never telling them what's wrong it turns out to be a really dangerous thing. So it's really important just in general to be giving feedback always, like always be giving feedback. And then negative feedback, not just about people, but about what's wrong in the company is critically important at a tech company. So if you think about the difference between really good companies and not so good companies, in good companies, the bad news really travels. So like, you know, gee, we're like, this product is all like screwed up and everybody knows it, we all talk about it, and we deal with it and we go fix it. In bad companies, people know it's screwed up, but nobody will say anything because they don't want to get screamed at by the executive, or they don't want like somebody who's sensitive who worked on it to get upset. And so you kind of really want a culture that's desensitized to hearing negative feedback. You just want people used to that and happy to just say, oh, this is a problem, great, we'll go improve it, as opposed to, oh my God, I can't believe that you're, you know, criticizing the way that I like check in code that doesn't work.
What are some of the, obviously you see so many different CEOs through your various investments. What are the top issues that they run into?
Yeah, well, there's two big issues that everybody runs into. So one is, look, when you're small, like the big issue is, do you actually get the product right and, you know, something that everybody wants to use? And that's an incredibly hard problem. And it's hard to manage through because, as you know, most of our CEOs start out as product people, but then they're CEO and they're not sure exactly how much to exercise their will in the product sometimes. And so that's always a challenge. And if you don't get that right, then the good news is you don't have other problems, because that's the problem that kills you. But then the next problem, if you get any kind of success on your product and you start to grow your company, is communication. So communication, like if you and I start a company, communication's easy. You know, we have a problem, we talk about it. You know, we want to do something, we talk about it. There's no process, there's no formal meetings, there's no organizational design, there's none of that. But when you're 100 people, you can't all get in a room and talk about every problem. And so then there gets to be this drift, and like people don't quite know exactly what they should be working on, and people work on something that somebody else should know about and they don't talk. Somebody builds something that somebody else should use in their part of the code and they don't know about it and they don't use it, and they duplicate the functionality.
Is it just silos of information then?
Well, it's just information flow across, you know, the bigger the organization, the harder a problem that is. And so I spent a lot of time with CEOs going, well, what is the communication architecture of the company? How does it work? How should it work? How do you know if it's working? How do you know what people know? And how do you improve it? And every time you kind of increase the size of the company, you have to consider about whether you have to change the architecture. So it's kind of like, you know, if it's engineering, right, like there's designs where everything talks to each other, and then at some point you need like a communication bus, so you can just put something on the bus and like other people who are interested in it can get it. And that's, you know, companies are a lot like that, like what needs a communication bus, what's a point-to-point communication, and how does that all work? And that's hard, and that's generally, when things get chaotic, it's when CEOs don't spend enough time on the communication architecture, and they spend too much time on whatever, you know, either being an awesome, you know, PR person or selling too much or doing other things that aren't running the company.
When you talk about scaling up a team, you know, a lot of our entrepreneurs here are just a handful of people, 3, 4 people. When you grow to 10, 15, I had a startup that I met the other day that had 4 employees and they were all VPs. But when's the right time to add directors, VPs? Like, how do you feel about all that?
Yeah, we call that not enough Indians, right?
Right.
Too many VPs. Well, it's tricky, right? And a lot of it is company specific. So generally, the job of a vice president is to, you know, like from a title standpoint, if you bring someone in as a vice president, they're going to have an expectation that they're going to do a job of a vice president. Well, what's that job? Well, it's kind of managing several layers of management, a director layer and a manager layer. And so if they don't have any people, just the fact that they wanted to do that job means that's the job they wanted to do, and they probably don't know how to do the job that they're in. Or they don't want to do the job that they're in. And any of that is a problem. So generally, you kind of want those positions as the company gets to the size that it needs them, like that's the best and the most kind of organic, the most natural as opposed to artificially flavored. Now, of course, there are times in companies where like there's some reason to put them on steroids and to have those artificial hormones injected in, but they cause issues. There are side effects, and so you just have to be careful. But in general, the general rule of thumb is you kind of hire them as needed when the organization kind of gets to the size and scope where you require that functionality. And I wrote a post once called the scale anticipation fallacy, which is a lot of times you get advice, particularly if you think about recruiters and VCs, what we see as the failure is some manager that didn't scale. And so we're always trying to correct for that, especially recruiters, right? Like somebody didn't scale big enough, and so that's the failure. They don't see the other failure, which is, somebody came in too senior and couldn't do the job. They don't, that's a harder one for them to understand the why on. So as a result, they always want the CEO to get more scalable people. Well, like one, you don't know who's going to scale in your organization. You just can't know. You can't know in advance. And then it's fine if somebody does a great job running engineering for a year and a half and then can't scale to run the bigger engineering organization. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's fine. It's not really a failure. It's like you got a year and a half out of somebody doing a good-ass job. Like, good. Pat on the back. Like, not failure. And the real dumb thing is to bring in somebody who could manage it 2 years from now but can't manage it today. Because they're going to fail, and you're never going to get to the 2 years. So they're going to suck now, and they're not going to get to later. So much better good now and can't do later than suck now and can't do later. There's often a CEO, you're deciding between like crap and like horrifying. And crap is better than horrifying.
What do you look for in an entrepreneur? When someone comes to pitch you and you walk into the meeting for the first time and they're sitting down there, like what traits are you looking for? Is it the idea? Is it the team?
Yeah, so, and there's really not that many things that I find to be really important, but there are a few. So one is, which we talk about a lot around here in Silicon Valley, just breakthrough idea. Like, is this idea something that's really going to move the needle or not? But the one that, to me is just as important is, then does the founder have the courage to build the company and to build it into an actual company as opposed to, just an idea that gets sold to like a really good company like Google, or something like that. But do they have the courage? Well, courage is tricky, but I find, so we spend usually in our pitch meetings, we'll spend the first 30 minutes not going through the pitch, but just talking about the founder and their background and understanding why they made decisions. And a lot of courage is, are you willing, what do you believe in? Peter Thiel's got a great thing on this. What do you believe that nobody else does? Do you have the courage to even say that? And then a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just test every decision that they made and, see if they even have the courage to explain it. Say something, put them in a position where saying something to us will likely upset us if you were looking at it from their perspective. And if they're willing to do that because it's right, like that's a great show of courage.
Can you give me an example of that at all?
Yeah, so, and it tends to be like very specific to the entrepreneur's story. Well, I'll give you a great example of how we found out about courage. So an entrepreneur came into us once, his name was Christian Georgi. And I said, tell me about your background. And he's like, well, I used to be the CTO of a company called OutlookSoft. And OutlookSoft sold to SAP for 3 years. And I was like, no, where'd you grow up? And he goes, really, you want me to go back that far? I said, yeah. He said, well, I grew up in Romania in the 80s. And then in 1989, in order to escape the communist regime, I swam across the Danube. And I said, well, we're going to invest in your company. And, that's a lot of how it goes. But courage, Aristotle said courage is the first virtue. And the reason he said that, and it's really, really important in leadership, is all these other, integrity, honesty, and so forth, people can have them, But the question isn't, do you have, everybody kind of has them in certain situations, but that's not the question. The question is, do you have it, like, if it's going to cost you your company, do you have your integrity? If it's going to cost you your job, are you honest? If it's going to completely embarrass you in front of everybody, like, do you have it then? And the only way you have it then is if you have courage. And so courage ends up being the foundation for a lot of what we need in an entrepreneur. And I always say, you know, you need kind of two things. You need great intelligence and great courage. And I always found as an entrepreneur, my courage was tested far more than my intelligence. And I think that's pretty universal. So that's something we really like to focus on.
How about technically? I mean, you look for a good, solid engineering co-founder, someone that understands product. What role does design play now? How important is that?
Well, design is really interesting in that there are a bunch of companies. You know, we're invested in 2, Pinterest and Airbnb, that are run by designers, which is something like you'd never see in the past. But interestingly, like, you know, one of the great entrepreneurs of our time, or of all time, Steve Jobs, was like really essentially a designer. Like, he understood enough about technology, as does Brian, as does Ben at Pinterest, but they're designers. Like, they're designers by trade, and that's their great skill, and that's their great talent. And what we found is, one, like, it's pretty rare that the designer is the CEO. But if they are, that's a very good sign, because it means that they've got so much, because the designers, like MBAs naturally, they all want to be CEO. Every single person who has an MBA wants to be CEO. Very few are qualified, but they all want to do it. Almost nobody who goes to design school wants to be a CEO. They all want to be artists, right? Like, so if you have someone, a designer, that has such a compelling vision and idea, and so much courage that it compels them to be CEO, and then they have the courage to do it and start a company, like, that's an actually very positive indicator for us. Mm-hmm. It's rare. It's rare because most designers, like, that's not why you go to design school, so that you can run a big corporation. Like, nobody thinks of it that way.
Any first-time kind of pitch mistakes that people make, where you're just like, they're not getting to the product, they're putting too much data up front, projecting too far out?
Yeah, well, you know, to me, the big thing on pitches is the big mistake people make is they try to appeal too much to the venture capitalists. So the thing, and that'll drive us crazy, because it's a little bit of a sign of anti-courage. Like, so they'll put a plan in, and they'll be, okay, here's our plan for the next 2 years, and they'll have their financial plan. And I'll be like, well, if everything you told me before is true, then isn't this like a plan to fail? Because, like, if you look at the market size and you look at the product and when it's going to hit and so forth, like, if all that's true, then this plan is like 1/10 the size of what it should be. And they're like, yeah, but we thought you wanted to hear this, because we, you know, VCs like conservatism. And I'm like, well, the fact that you care what I like makes me not like you. And that's kind of, you know, so that's the biggest mistake. Now, that may not be a mistake with some other VCs, but for me, because courage is such an important thing, anything that shows a lack of conviction or courage or belief in what you're doing is what always ends up worrying me. Like, either you believe it or you don't, either you're committed or you're not, either you have the courage to build the company or you don't. And it is a really high bar. I mean, like, you know, I'm talking like, oh yeah, I'm like King Courage, you know, I was sweating bullets when I was CEO, and I was like, my guts were boiling, and like I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning just like all you. And I know some of you are. You're sitting there silent, but you know you were sweating, and you'll probably go home tonight and start sweating. But like, so that's part of it. And courage isn't, it's not that you don't feel fear. You feel just, Customato has this great line where he says, like, the difference between a hero and a coward isn't what they feel. They feel the exact same thing. It's what they do. And so we're just looking for people who, not that don't feel the fear, that feel it fully, but then somehow find a way to do the right thing, the courageous thing, the hard thing, even if you don't know it's right at the time.
Talk to me about board meetings. Who runs the show? What's the perfect board meeting for you? It seems that this is something that like all entrepreneurs really fear. Like, they have to put that deck together every single month, and it's like this week-long process sometimes. Like, what do you want to see?
Well, so the board meeting, it's a couple things. One, so part of it is actually for the entrepreneur. So like probably the most valuable thing that comes out of a board meeting of a startup is it's a kind of forcing function, process function to get everybody in the company to take a step back and say, okay, what are we doing? How are we doing? Are we on track? And if you don't have a board meeting, you don't actually ever do that, right? Like you never go, like you're kind of in the forest chopping down trees, you're in the war, like, you know, shooting the enemy. You're not looking back and saying, okay, is the game plan right? So the board meeting is kind of that time that you can prepare to do that. So to me, you know, the first thing is, you know, as the entrepreneur, do you get that accomplished? Do you get your people to get to a set of data that makes you feel like you've got a good overview of where the company is and this is a good checkpoint? And if you do that and present that at the board meeting and then kind of have time to discuss interesting issues, then you're doing pretty good. Like then you're in like the 95th percentile. And you know, I think people get, one, like board members like to be like super involved in all kinds of product strategy and details and so forth, but that doesn't mean they're good at it. And one of the things that you'll notice when you're running a company is the knowledge gap between the people in the company and the people on the board starts out small and gets big over time. So when you start your company, your VC will have all these really interesting insights. But then when you're like a year into it, like, and you know every bit of customer feedback, you know the product architecture cold, you know like what you can do and what you can't do, and they come in with, you know, out of left field, oh, I think you should put a button here, and it's like, all right, great. Like, you know, like, do you understand anything about product strategy and the amount of knowledge that you have to do it correctly and so forth? So it gets kind of frustrating. So you don't want to put yourself in that position where the board is kind of trying to do the product strategy on what you're doing. Where the board can be useful, though, is what are you not doing? So one of the problems in running a company is you spend all your time and all your energy optimizing, tuning, refining, A/B testing, getting really good at what you're doing. But then there's a whole world of stuff you're not doing, and one of those things may be something you should do. And a good board, if you kind of give them the right context, can go, you know, we ought to also do this. And sometimes it might even be, we ought to buy this company because like if we had this and that, then this becomes like a real primary company. And if we just do this, then we're going to have to get acquired at some point. And that's a lot easier to see from the outside than from the inside. So there's those kind, you know, you want the right kind of strategy from the board, not the wrong kind of strategy.
How much of that do you share with the staff? I've seen some companies take the entire board deck and just send it around to everyone and have an open conversation about that.
Yeah, so I think transparency in general is very good. You don't want to share noise, but for sure, the board decks and so forth, distributing those. Now, once you go public, you know, one of the things that I think some of the recent companies from Silicon Valley that went public found out the hard way is, like, you're forced, if you're transparent and you're public with all your employees, then you lock them up and they can't trade their stock. So like you do have to just be aware, like when you cross that line. But before you cross the line, I think sharing as much as you can is smart in general. Don't protect your employees from bad information or bad news or negative stuff, and don't like try and, like a huge mistake is, because when you recruit people, you want to tell them how great it's going to be, and then they get in, and like you want to keep that story going, so you don't tell them the truth about like, oh, guess what? Like these numbers are down. Like that's a huge mistake. Like whatever you told to get them here, like you got to tell them the truth once they're there, and you told them the truth, hopefully the truth attractively when they came in, but you have to tell them the whole truth once they join the company, and you have to share information. If you're off track, you're off track. But you know, lying to your employees or hiding stuff from your employees, I think is almost suicidal. It's very dangerous.
Looking forward next 12, 18 months, your investments, where's your focus? What are you seeing that you like right now?
Yeah, so one of our, other than Rap Genius, that's a joke, I just made an investment in Rap Genius. So we're, you know, thematically, one of the big things that we're really focused on is a concept that we call software eats the world, which basically the idea is that software has gotten to an advanced enough state where industries that previously weren't really impacted by software are now being like highly impacted. And so, we've got a company that's making robot toys, and it's really a robot operating system that is able to run these things. And so, software eating toys, and maybe something that you wouldn't expect. We're in another company that we call Software Eats Dirt, called Solum, which is kind of software applied to agriculture and figuring out things like proper crop rotation based on better data analysis of soil samples and these kinds of things. And we think that basically every industry, and you can see it coming in financial services, and you can see it coming in education for sure, is going to be kind of dominated by a really good software company in the future. And
are we going too
really
far though? Like I've seen
do we have a choice?
I mean, you have like these services.
Of course we're
now.
going too far.
You have the phone and you go and you try and request, an ice cream cone being delivered to your house by an Uber driver that's, it keeps going and going and going.
Life remote control. I think Matt Kohler wrote a good post on that.
What do you think about the life remote control?
You mean as like a philosophical society? So the first thing is, I think it's inevitable. So technology, right, etymologically means a better way of doing things. So right or wrong, there were a lot of things about the wheel that were like worse, right? Like now we used to be in such good shape. We used to carry stuff around all the time, and now we got the wheel. We're just lazy and fat, like we're totally out of condition. The lion's just going to run behind us and eat us. But that's not going to stop the wheel because it's just a better way of doing it. And so the people who have the wheel are going to crush the people without the wheel. And technology in general is very like that. So I don't know how relevant a question it ends up being. And Andy Grove had a great line. Somebody asked him, they said, well, are microprocessors good or are they bad? And he said, well, that's kind of a weird question. It's like asking if steel is good or bad. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad, it is. And we better learn to live with it. And I think that's the case with these things. Now, look, there's a lot of bad. Like, having said that, there's a lot of things that are worse about having microwave ovens and having, the world in your pocket, particularly in, how people interact with their children, how they interact with each other. A lot of that's getting degraded in not great ways. But that's, those are other opportunities for entrepreneurs to maybe improve those things now. So the great thing about technology is it creates almost as many problems as it solves.
How often do you say no to these startups that are pitching you, and what's the primary reason? I mean, if you can nail it down to if there's any theme or one thing.
Well, we almost always say no, I guess, is and that's one really important thing to realize when you're raising money is every VC says no, over 95% of the time. And I think for us it's closer to 99% of the time, just based on the deals we actually do. And so when we say no, one thing that we do is we always try to say why, because if you're an entrepreneur, that's valuable. You're trying to build a company and somebody turns you down. One, you'd like to get a no. When I raised money, I talked to probably 20 people that didn't invest that never told me no. Usually when you get turned down by an investor, it has more to do with the investor than it does to do with the entrepreneur. And the reason is, you can only do so many deals. For me, for example, I can go on the board of, maybe 10 companies, and then I'm out. So if you think about the number of entrepreneurs that would like to raise money from me, that's just a really small percentage. And, it could be my interest, it could be what I had for lunch that day, it could be anything that would cause, a no to come out. It's just, this is how it is. So when raising money, it's important to know that you're looking for a market of one. You just need one person to want to do it, and then you're off to the races. And so I wouldn't get, it's great if somebody tells you why, but I would never take anything that happens in fundraising personally as a personal assessment of what you're doing. And the greatest kind of technology companies ever built have tremendous stories about getting turned down by venture capitalists. So, yeah, that just is what it is.
Yep. One last question from me. What do you think that Andreessen Horowitz does really well, and what other firms do you like?
Yeah, so the thing that I believe we do better, certainly than the firms that were around when I raised money as an entrepreneur, and it's really our whole focus, is we're very, very good at helping the technical founder become a CEO. And that's important in our model because we much prefer the founder to run the company, and we have a lot of reasons for that. But the combination of knowledge of everything that's happened and then commitment to that, to making that company work. And a lot of times, like, commitment when it doesn't even make sense to have commitment is what makes a company succeed. Certainly the case in my case. So we do a lot too. So when the partners are founders and CEOs, so the person on your board is going to be a founder and CEO. The company is set up to give you a professional CEO quality network. So, and we are configured a lot like Google Ventures in that way, where access to talent, access to the press, access to customers. Like, we spend a lot of time and a big investment and a huge number of people in giving you that network, so you don't have to kind of come to the table with it. So that's what we're good at. In terms of the firms we like, well, we like you guys because you're set up like us, so it's easy. We don't have to explain what you do, or they're just like us, but they're called Google Ventures, so that's good. We like, and beyond that, we like the Greylock guys a lot. We work with them, particularly Reed and Anil. We spend a lot of time working with them on various things, and we see eye to eye with them. There's definitely guys at Excel that we like, that we've worked with on various things. So, and it goes, it goes up and down. Like, sometimes people are on the friends list, and then sometimes they get unfriended.
All right, I think we're out of time. One more thing I wanted to mention is, not many people know this, but Mark Andreessen was a very early investor in Dig, and you, of course, were on the board.
Yeah.
I wanted to personally thank you for helping me out during good times and bad. You've been an awesome partner, and thanks for being a guest here today.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.